Well, clearly by the thumbnail and the title, you know what this is all about. Now originally, I wanted to do something else for this video. I wanted to, go out in the garage and do something on the Mustang. Until...
Jeez Louise, how cold does it need to be?
Yeah, that happened. Change of plans. Now we're going to talk about this, because this, somewhat, it's annoying. I'm not going to lie. I mean, I get it. I get why people get confused, but at the same time, it's like, come on now, right? That and that are not the same. The two do not correlate. They're not one and the same. You really can't even take simple things from this over here and apply it to that. It doesn't work. They run on two completely different systems. Now, whenever I make a video on really almost anything in relation to how engines work or how cars function or suspension or anything, there's bound to be somebody in the comments saying, well, tell that to the people running dragsters. Headers, right? Extremely important to have on a naturally aspirated motor. Not the case with dragsters. So people will look at dragsters and go, well, they don't run those, so that must mean they don't make power. These don't make power. Those make power. No, that's not how that works. And the reason for it is because your everyday street and strip, car runs on gasoline or a mixture of gasoline and ethanol, right? Even E85 is a mixture of gasoline and ethanol. Just E85 is 85% ethanol, supposedly. It's a gasoline-based fuel. Top fuel dragsters run on nitromethane. Completely different. And here's just a few reasons why that's the case. Now, with gasoline, air-fuel ratio, right, is very important. And getting the correct air-fuel ratio is, crucial in making power. Because, 12.5 to 1 really is kind of the sweet spot for most hot-rodded motors. Technically, the stoichiometric ratio is 14.7 to 1 or something like that, but you never run it that lean. Always a little extra fuel to help cool off the cylinder and the charge and everything in there, right? Because gasoline requires air to burn. It takes a certain amount of air mixed with gasoline in order for that to be combustible. Nitromethane has its own oxygen. While it does require a little outside air, most of the oxygen in that combustion comes from the fuel itself. Now, when you do that, you can dump as much of it in the cylinder as the cylinder will fill. Gasoline and air has to get atomized, and it has to come through here, and cylinder fill is a big deal, right? And trying to get as much out of the cylinder as possible before, it's all used up and the piston's just gliding down the bore at that point, not being pushed anymore. Nitromethane, you can fit as much nitromethane in the motor as the motor will physically handle. In fact, the nitromethane is still burning during the exhaust stroke. That's why flames come shooting out of those dragsters. When you have a fuel that has its own oxygen and you're able to pump as much of it in there as you want, certain things change. Like, for example, scavenging. Scavenging is extremely important on a naturally aspirated motor, even supercharged applications for making power, because you want to get as much out of that cylinder as possible in order to get fresh mixture in. Well, nitromethane, it's not that simple. Nitromethane, you're not burning all of the mixture during the actual combustion cycle. Most of it gets poured in, some of it combusts, and a lot of it gets shot right out the exhaust. Or, out the zoomies is what they use. So because of that, getting as much out as possible, scavenging is not important, because anything that's left in there is just unburnt and it will ignite just the same. In actuality, a nitro motor likes resistance. A nitro motor will make more power with resistance than it will without it. And that's completely contradictory to pretty much any engine we know of in a gasoline world. And that's because gasoline only can fit so much fuel and air into the cylinder atomized, and that fuel and air is usually used up a short way down, right? And the rest of the way, the piston is just pushed by momentum, not actually by the actual expanding gases. That's why the freer rotating your engine is, the more power it will produce, because it's not wasting what little energy it has in actually fighting against the resistance. But nitromethane is different. You can fit as much of that in the cylinder as you want. Matter of fact, you have so much in there that it's coming out during the exhaust stroke for a good reason. The nitromethane pushes the piston the whole way, right? And it gets relieved, the pressure gets relieved during overlap. That's why it doesn't just shove the piston right out the bottom of, well, ideally doesn't shove the piston right out the bottom of the engine. Sometimes that happens. It's because the exhaust stroke opens, relieving the pressure, so it's not, pressure goes out that way. Now, in a scenario like that, you actually want more resistance because you're not hindered by the mixture's ability to push, like in gasoline. The mixture is going to push the whole way. So the more resistance you have, the greater leverage that push can have on the rest of the drivetrain. Think of it like this. If you're trying to push on this wrench, but the wrench is freely just loose, you can't apply that much pressure to it. But if there's more resistance, now you can really crank on it and get the torques. Do you ever wonder why dragsters don't have nice streamlined, aerodynamic bodies? Because the aerodynamics, the actual drag from the wind passing over the dragster, gives it more power. The more resistance it has, the harder it can push on the piston, because the drivetrain's connected, right? I mean, it's just got a giant clutch and then the gears in the back. There's no transmission really to soften anything up. Whatever this engine's outputting is going directly to the tire. So the harder you can push on the piston, the harder it's pushing on the tire. The less you can push on the piston, the less it pushes on the tire, and the more that it just gets wasted out the exhaust. Now, what I mean by that, right? Because there's funny cars which has the, aero body on it. But that's actually to gain more resistance than the just regular dragster does with the big wing. That body creates a lot of downforce, equaling resistance. Now, nitro motors are actually tuned differently between how much resistance they have. The resistance of those cars is actually a tuning element, because, like I'll say later on, the parts are really the downfall of these motors, and you can't put too much power into them or they're just going to melt and break stuff. So just needed to clarify that, right? I know, comments. They do have aero bodies, but those bodies aren't so much to slip through the air as it is to just get massive amounts of downforce, equaling more resistance than just a normal dragster. If you were to take the two motors out, a funny car and a dragster, and swap them, they wouldn't run worth a darn. Now, I know that's a really hard concept to understand. More resistance equals more power. Wouldn't the resistance outweigh the power? Well, no. The power you gain is greater than the resistance gain. See what I mean? It's harder to rotate, but you gain so much more energy, it's worth it. This is how upside down the world is, right? Imagine you're trying to break a bolt loose, so you break out the breaker bar, right? Obviously, more tension, more, oomph on it to give you more leverage, right? Well, nitromethane motor is going to make more power with this dinky little guy than it will with this guy, because there's more resistance here, so you'll get more pressure here. Now, I'm not saying, nitromethane, you're not going to make more power with a longer stroke. This is just a way for you to try to understand, comprehend the backwards nature of those engines. Everything is different. Here's something. Back in the day, 70s, front engine dragsters, right? Running nitromethane, they used to fill the crankcase full of oil. Not like gasoline. Gasoline, we have a fill limit here, oil pan. No, the crankshaft was covered in oil, and it had to fight through that oil, and fighting through that oil made more power. And it also made them last longer that way too, because that oil absorbed the chaos that happens in a motor like that. I mean, you got that much stuff moving around, that oil really absorbed a lot of it. But they went to a dry sump pretty much to make cleanup easier when one explodes. They didn't want all the oil all over the place. And consequently, parts don't last quite as long anymore. One run, maybe two, and then she's done. Nitromethane is also extremely difficult to light. I mean, extremely difficult to atomize. The supercharger is there. They spray some nitro on the top of the supercharger just to try to whip it into some sort of atomization before it goes into the cylinder, so they at least have a chance to light it with 2 spark plugs and 2 separate magnetos. That's how much juice they need to try to light one of these things off, efficiently anyway. Then they spray more fuel right at the base. Basically has a multi-port injection and a throttle body injection all at the same time, just to try to get this stuff whipped into some kind of meaningful way to set it up on fire. And that's another reason why resistance helps them, because it gives them time to light that mixture to actually force the piston down. Most of the time, they're not running on all 8. They're running on 1, 2 here or there, and misfiring for most of them until they start going. Now, nitromethane's true limits are the actual parts themselves. See, nitromethane will make the most power in a concealed container, right? Where it has maximum resistance. But in an engine, that doesn't work very well. If you build a tight motor, it's going to blow itself apart with, that kind of construction. You need the motor to actually rotate around. So that's nitromethane's Achilles heel. It makes the most power with resistance, but if you build a motor with that much resistance, the parts themselves would not handle the pressure. So that's the limiting factor, the actual parts breaking. Now keep in mind, they don't run straight 100% nitromethane. They do it on a mix. Hey, quiet over there. The mix is like 50-50 or something now. It used to be a lot more nitromethane back in the day, but now they kind of leaned it out a bit. So that plays into effect too. It is for all those reasons why, no, whenever I'm talking about anything to do with a street strip car, you cannot translate it over to dragsters. They're just a completely different animal. And you know what? Go on YouTube, look up nostalgia, top fuel, nitromethane, listen to one of these running. Listen to it running on gasoline, purring like a kitten. Then listen to it on the nitro, and it just turns into a complete monster, right? They're 2 different things. And you can't really equate one to another accurately. Well, that's pretty much my limited knowledge on nitromethane. You guys got any experience? Post it down in the comments. Tell me if I'm right, wrong, or somewhere in between, because I've never worked on one. They're just very curious and very, awesome to watch, right? But that's it for now, and I'll catch you next time.